When the ancient Gnostics spoke about the illusory nature of the material world, they already understood something that quantum physics would only come to confirm millennia later. Reality as we perceive it is fundamentally malleable, a field of possibilities that responds to the consciousness of the observer. In the Gospel of Thomas, an apocryphal text discovered in 1945 in the caves of Nag Hammadi, we find the enigmatic Logion 22 that instructs us to become passers-by, an expression that, seen through the lens of contemporary knowledge about morphogenetic fields, suggests nothing less than a precise method for transcending the limitations of consensual reality. If the Gnostics really possessed techniques to manipulate the fabric of reality through consciousness, and if these techniques were deliberately hidden from the public for millennia, what happens when we rediscover this knowledge and apply it with the understanding of quantum fields and modern morphogenetic theory? Would we be facing the most powerful source code to reprogram our experience in the universe? Gnosticism, far from being just another religious current of antiquity, represents one of the most radical and transformative knowledge systems ever conceived by humanity. Emerging in the first centuries of the Christian era, but with roots dating back to much older esoteric traditions from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece, Gnostic thought proposed something revolutionary. This material world is not a perfect creation of a benevolent God, but a prison built by inferior entities, the archons, to keep our consciousnesses trapped in a state of cosmic amnesia. Have you ever wondered why certain spiritual truths seem to awaken something so deep within you, as if you had always known them? The Nag Hammadi manuscripts, discovered in Egypt in 1945 by a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Salman, represent the greatest treasure of Gnostic texts ever found, having survived centuries of persecution and systematic attempts at erasure. Among these documents, the Gospel of Thomas emerges as a jewel of non-narrative wisdom, 114 sayings or logia attributed to Jesus, but of a radically different nature from the canonical Gospels. Curious how this text was kept hidden from the public for more than 1,600 years, isn't it? The Coptic version discovered at Nag Hammadi is dated to the 4th century, but earlier Greek fragments found at Oxyrhynchus confirm that the text was already circulating in the 2nd century, possibly as old as the earliest Gospels of the New Testament. What makes the Gospel of Thomas so powerful is its non-dualistic approach to reality. Unlike conventional religious texts that separate creator and creation, heaven and earth, salvation and damnation, Thomas presents a Jesus who teaches the dissolution of boundaries between observer and observed, a principle that resonates surprisingly with the discoveries of quantum physics about the fundamental role of the observer in the manifestation of reality. When you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside and the outside like the inside, then will you enter the kingdom, says Jesus in Logion 22, anticipating by millennia the quantum understanding of non-locality and entanglement. The persecution of the Gnostics by the early institutionalized church was not accidental. Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon, in his treatise Against Heresies, 180 AD, devoted himself especially to attacking those who followed the Gospel of Thomas, calling them perverters of truth. Why so much fear of a text? Perhaps because Gnosticism offered something revolutionary: the possibility of direct knowledge, gnosis, of the divine, without institutional intermediaries. The idea that each human being possesses a dormant divine spark and can awaken to their true nature directly threatened the power of emerging religious hierarchies. The Gnostic concept of the demiurge, the inferior entity that created the material world as an imperfect simulation of the true spiritual realm, finds impressive parallels in what contemporary theoretical physicists like Tom Campbell and computer scientists like Nick Bostrom propose in their simulated universe hypotheses. If we live in a reality designed with specific parameters, whose fundamental laws can be altered when we understand their programmatic nature, wouldn't we be facing the same intuition that the Gnostics expressed through their cosmic mythology? Morphogenetic fields, a theory proposed by English biologist Rupert Sheldrake in the 1980s, offer a fascinating bridge between ancient Gnosticism and cutting-edge science. These non-physical fields of organizational information are responsible for the formation and behavior of biological, mental, and social systems. When Sheldrake proposed that memory is not stored in the brain, but accessed by it through these fields of morphic resonance, the scientific community reacted with hostility, just as religious authorities reacted to the Gnostics. Coincidence? Or are we facing knowledge so transformative that power structures have always sought to suppress it? Logion 22 of the Gospel of Thomas, in particular, deserves our special attention. Jesus tells his disciples, "When you make the two one, when you make the inside like the outside and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, when you make the male and the female one and the same, then will you enter the kingdom." This cryptic instruction can be understood as a precise protocol for transcending the duality programmed into our perception of reality, a key to accessing and modifying the morphogenetic fields that sustain our consensual experience of the world. The Gnostics understood that ordinary human perception is a form of collective hypnosis, maintained by archons, which we can reinterpret today as self-preserving patterns of information that resist changes in the system. Plato's famous allegory of the cave, which many consider a direct influence on Gnostic thought, perfectly illustrates this condition. Prisoners chained since birth mistake shadows projected on a wall for complete reality. Isn't this exactly what we experience when we take our conditioned thoughts and limited perceptions as absolute truth? While conventional materialist science still struggles to integrate consciousness into its model of reality, pioneering researchers like Dean Radin, Robert John, and Brenda Dunn from Princeton University have accumulated decades of experimental evidence showing that the human mind can directly influence random physical systems. The Global Consciousness Project, using random number generators, RNGs, scattered around the world, has convincingly documented how events of great collective emotional impact produce statistically significant deviations in the randomness patterns of these devices. What does this tell us about the true nature of reality? Wouldn't this be precisely validating what the Gnostics taught, that material reality responds to and is shaped by consciousness? Logion 22 of Thomas, in instructing us to become passers-by, offers more than a poetic metaphor. It proposes a method for transcending the archetypal limitations imposed on human consciousness. When Jesus says, "Make eyes in place of an eye," he suggests a multidimensional perception that goes beyond linear processing of reality. Exactly the kind of expanded consciousness necessary to reprogram the morphogenetic fields that sustain our collective consensus about what is real and possible. Are we, after 2 millennia of suppression of this knowledge, finally ready to reclaim these techniques and consciously apply them to transform not only our individual lives, but the very fabric of shared reality? When Werner Heisenberg and Niels Bohr formulated the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics in the 1920s, a silent revolution began to shake the foundations of scientific materialism that dominated Western thought. The discovery that subatomic particles exist in states of probabilistic superposition until observed, the famous collapse of the wave function, introduced something unthinkable for the Newtonian paradigm: the consciousness of the observer as a fundamental element in the manifestation of physical reality. What few mainstream scientists recognized is that this revolutionary discovery was, in fact, aligned with what the Gnostics had been teaching for millennia. Material reality is not an objective and independent system, but a field of possibilities that responds to consciousness. The double-slit experiment, considered by Richard Feynman to contain the only mystery of quantum mechanics, demonstrates something extraordinary. Electrons, photons, and even entire molecules behave as waves of possibility when unobserved, but materialize as defined particles when a measuring apparatus is introduced. Even more surprisingly, when scientists tried to spy on the particles without disturbing the system, the mere potential knowledge of which path the particle would take was enough to collapse the wave interference pattern. How can we not see here a direct echo of the Gnostic teaching that consciousness is prior to matter, and not the other way around? Physicist John Wheeler, a collaborator of Einstein and one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, took these implications to the extreme with his delayed choice experiment and his concept of a participatory universe. Wheeler proposed that not only the present, but potentially the distant past of the universe could be determined by choices made by conscious observers in the present. No phenomenon is a real phenomenon until it is an observed phenomenon, he declared, echoing almost word for word what the Gospel of Thomas teaches in Logion 5. Recognize what is in your sight, and that which is hidden from you will become plain to you. For there is nothing hidden which will not become manifest. The implications of quantum entanglement, experimentally confirmed by Alain Aspect in 1982 and refined in subsequent experiments that close all theoretical loopholes, are even more profound. Two entangled particles maintain an instantaneous connection regardless of the distance separating them, a phenomenon Einstein called spooky action at a distance. This principle of non-locality suggests that, at the fundamental level, the universe is a unified system where spatial separations are illusory, exactly as the Gnostics taught about the fragmented nature of human perception and the underlying unity of the pleroma, the divine totality. Neuroscientist Carl Pribram, working independently but in parallel with physicist David Bohm, developed the holographic model of the brain and consciousness, suggesting that the mind does not store memories in specific locations, but as distributed interference patterns, similar to a hologram. Bohm, in turn, proposed that the universe itself functions as a hologram, with each part containing information about the whole, an implicate order underlying the explicate order we perceive. Isn't this exactly what the Jesus of the Gospel of Thomas teaches in Logion 77, when he says, "I am the light that is above them all. I am the all. From me did the all come forth, and unto me did the all extend. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." Dean Radin's experiments at the Institute of Noetic Sciences have extensively documented how human intention can influence apparently random physical systems with undeniable statistical significance. In his double-slit experiment with a human observer, Radin demonstrated that mere conscious intention, without any physical interaction, was sufficient to alter the behavior of photons, creating a measurable interference pattern. When Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, "If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here,' and it will move," was he literally referring to this capacity of focused consciousness to reorganize the energy matrix of physical reality? Physicist Amit Goswami, in his influential work The Self-Aware Universe, proposes a monistic idealism based on quantum mechanics, where consciousness is not an emergent epiphenomenon of matter, but the primordial foundation of reality. According to Goswami, consciousness chooses among superposed quantum possibilities, causing the collapse of the wave function and manifesting a specific reality among infinite possibilities. This model resolves paradoxes such as Schrödinger's cat and offers a theoretical framework that, surprisingly, aligns perfectly with the Gnostic concept that material reality is a crystallization of divine consciousness fragmented into multiple observers. Sheldrake's morphogenetic fields, mentioned earlier, find interesting support in quantum phenomena such as the so-called quantum Zeno effect, where continuous observation of a quantum system can prevent its natural evolution. In simple terms, repeatedly observing a system can freeze it in a particular state, inhibiting the transition to other possible states. Wouldn't this be the mechanism by which crystallized patterns of collective perception in morphogenetic fields limit what we experience as possible reality? And isn't this precisely what Logion 22 of Thomas teaches us to transcend, when it instructs us to become passers-by, in essence, to slide between states of reality that would normally be fixed by perceptual consensus? Contemporary experiments with meditation and altered states of consciousness, such as those conducted by psychiatrist Rick Strassman with DMT, the spirit molecule, and Stanislav Grof's studies on holotropic states, consistently reveal that people in deep states of non-ordinary consciousness report experiences surprisingly similar to Gnostic cosmologies: encounters with archetypal entities, perception of reality as an informational matrix, dissolution of separation between observer and observed, and direct access to what appears to be a universal source of knowledge. Coincidence? Or do these states fundamentally alter the observer's relationship with the quantum field underlying material reality? Logion 22 of the Gospel of Thomas, when analyzed through the lens of quantum physics, reveals itself not as an obscure mystical riddle, but as a precise protocol for altering the fundamental relationship between observer and observed. When Jesus instructs his disciples to make the inside like the outside and the outside like the inside, isn't he describing the experiential recognition of non-duality between consciousness and matter? When he speaks of making the two one, isn't he pointing to the transcendence of fragmented perception which, according to quantum physicists, is merely a perceptual construct superimposed on a unified field of possibilities? The question that confronts us is deeply personal. Are we ready to abandon the safety of consensual reality and directly experience the malleable nature of the quantum fabric of existence? Quantum physics and Gnosticism converge in the understanding that reality is not fixed and immutable, but a dynamic and participatory process, where the division between observer and observed is a functional illusion. As physicist Fred Alan Wolf proposes in his work, Mind into Matter, quantum mechanics essentially demonstrates that observers create reality through the act of observation. This statement would not be considered heretical in first-century Gnostic circles. It would be recognized as the fundamental truth that Jesus conveys when he says, in Logion 3 of the Gospel of Thomas, "The kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father." Is this not the call that resonates through the millennia? To recognize our nature as conscious co-creators of a reality that responds to and reflects our own consciousness? The theory of morphogenetic fields, proposed by British biologist Rupert Sheldrake in the 1980s, represented one of the most courageous scientific attempts to transcend the materialistic reductionism that dominates academic thinking. While conventional biology remains attached to the dogma that all organic form and behavior can be explained exclusively by genetics and biochemistry, Sheldrake proposed something revolutionary. There exists a non-physical field of organizational information that guides the development of organisms, preserves collective memories, and facilitates learning through what he called morphic resonance. Have you ever imagined that when you learn something new, you're not just modifying your individual brain, but contributing to an informational field accessible to the entire human species? The concept of morphic resonance explains phenomena that remain mysterious to conventional science. How ant colonies on different continents demonstrate identical collective behaviors without direct communication. How crystals of newly synthesized compounds become progressively easier to crystallize worldwide. How certain bird species adopt new behaviors that mysteriously spread to isolated populations. Hans Driesch, a German embryologist, observed in the early 20th century that when dividing a sea urchin embryo in two, each half developed into a complete sea urchin, a phenomenon impossible to explain through mechanistic determinism. He postulated the existence of an organizing entelechy field, a direct precursor to Sheldrake's morphogenetic fields. Sheldrake's most controversial experiment, the learned rat experiment, demonstrated that rats in laboratories around the world learned a specific task more quickly after rats elsewhere had already mastered it, even without any possibility of communication between them. When scientists at the McDonnell Laboratory in the USA and the University of Melbourne in Australia conducted the same experiment independently, both reported similar effects of accelerated learning. In analyzing this phenomenon of transpersonal learning, aren't we facing the empirical confirmation of what the Gnostics called Akasha, or Akashic records, a cosmic repository of all information and memory? Morphic resonance also offers an elegant explanation for the 100th monkey phenomenon, documented by Lyle Watson in Japanese macaques that learned to wash potatoes in the sea. When a critical number of individuals acquired the behavior, it seemed to spread instantly to colonies on distant islands. This non-local transmission of behavioral information finds a perfect parallel with Logion 108 of the Gospel of Thomas. Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. I myself will become him, and the hidden things will be revealed to him. Wasn't Jesus describing precisely the phenomenon of morphogenetic resonance, where direct contact with a higher consciousness field transforms the receiver into a new transmitter of that same field? The pioneering work of biologist Harold Saxton Burr at Yale revealed that all living organisms are surrounded by measurable electrodynamic fields that precede and shape physical development. Using ultrasensitive voltmeters, Burr detected the electric field of a seed even before it germinated, already containing the pattern of what the plant would become. In the 1940s, he wrote, "The pattern of the organism exists before the organism itself, a direct experimental confirmation of the Platonic and Gnostic intuition about archetypes that precede physical materialization." When the Gospel of Thomas states in Logion 84, "When you see your likeness, you rejoice. But when you see your images which came into being before you and which neither die nor become manifest, how much you will have to bear." Isn't it referring precisely to these primordial morphogenetic fields that precede our physical existence? Neuroscientist Carl Prebram expanded the concept of morphogenetic fields with his holographic model of the brain, proposing that our memories are not located in specific brain regions, but distributed as interference patterns, similar to a hologram. This revolutionary perspective gained empirical support when lobotomy patients retained memories that should have been excised, and when rats continued to perform complex tasks even after removal of substantial portions of their brains. If memory is not in brain tissue, where would it be? Canadian neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield, after electrically stimulating the brains of hundreds of patients and provoking vivid recollections, concluded that it seems that the brain does not store memories itself, but functions more like a receiver that tunes into memories stored elsewhere, exactly as Sheldrake proposed with his morphogenetic fields. Researcher Natasha Tsakos from Princeton University documented how groups of people meditating with focused intention influence random number generators, RNGs, creating statistically significant non-random patterns. But her most controversial work revealed that these effects seemed contagious. People without meditative training, upon entering environments where intense meditation had occurred, demonstrated similar ability to influence RNGs. This phenomenon of morphogenetic contagion has been documented in multiple laboratories, but rarely published in conventional journals due to its heterodox nature. Wouldn't this be the scientific basis for what esoteric traditions call initiation? The direct transmission of a state of consciousness from master to disciple through field resonance? Italian researcher Emilio Del Giudice, working in the field of quantum electrodynamics, QED, mathematically demonstrated how water molecules can organize themselves into coherence domains, regions where millions of molecules oscillate in synchrony, creating coherent electromagnetic fields. These discoveries scientifically ground the controversial water memory, proposed by Jacques Benveniste and later explored by Luc Montagnier, Nobel Prize winner for discovering HIV. Most fascinatingly, these aqueous coherence domains can store and transmit biological information through specific electromagnetic frequencies, exactly like a morphogenetic field. Considering that our bodies are composed mainly of water, wouldn't we be functioning literally as living antennas for these morphogenetic information fields, as suggested by Logion 17 of Thomas? I shall give you what no eye has seen and what no ear has heard and what no hand has touched and what has never occurred to the human mind. Biophotonics, a pioneering field developed by German biophysicist Fritz Albert Popp, empirically documented how all living cells constantly emit ultra-weak photons, biophotonic light, in coherent patterns. More surprisingly, Popp demonstrated that this emission is not mere metabolic byproduct, but seems to constitute a non-local intercellular communication system. Experiments with separated tissue cultures demonstrated that cells can influence the metabolism of other cells without chemical contact, purely through these biophotonic fields. When the Jesus of the Gospel of Thomas declares, "I am the light that is above them all," Logion 77, wasn't he referring not only metaphorically, but literally to this network of luminous communication that interconnects all life? The most provocative work on morphogenetic fields comes from researcher Lynn McTaggart and the HeartMath Institute, documenting how the human heart's electromagnetic field extends several meters beyond the physical body and can be detected by sophisticated magnetic sensors. More surprisingly, studies have shown that this cardiac field can synchronize between people in physical or emotional proximity, even without direct contact, a phenomenon called heart entrainment. When two people in a harmonious emotional state are monitored, their heartbeats and brain patterns often enter into spontaneous coherence. Wouldn't this be the biophysical basis for Logion 30 of Thomas? Where there are three gods, they are gods. Where there are two or one, I am with him. Describing how the presence of Christ, higher consciousness, manifests precisely in this field of morphogenetic coherence that forms between individuals in spiritual attunement. Logion 22 of the Gospel of Thomas represents one of Jesus' most enigmatic and potentially transformative teachings, preserved only in this apocryphal text. Jesus saw infants being suckled. He said to his disciples, "These infants being suckled are like those who enter the kingdom." They said to him, "Shall we then, as children, enter the kingdom?" Jesus said to them, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, and when you make the male and the female one and the same, so that the male not be male nor the female female, and when you fashion eyes in the place of an eye, and a hand in place of a hand, and a foot in place of a foot, and a likeness in place of a likeness, then will you enter the kingdom." This passage, far from being mere mystical poetry, can be interpreted as a precise protocol for reprogramming human perception and, consequently, the matrix of reality we collectively experience. Have you considered the possibility that these seemingly paradoxical instructions are, in fact, a technical code for transcending the limitations of ordinary consciousness? The first key to this protocol lies in the phrase, "when you make the two one," an instruction to transcend the fundamental duality that conditions our perception of reality. Neuroscientist Jill Bolt Taylor, after suffering a stroke that temporarily deactivated her left brain hemisphere, associated with analytical and categorizing thinking, reported a profound experience of unity with the universe, where the boundaries between her body and the environment completely disappeared. Her scientific account, documented in the book My Stroke of Insight, describes precisely the state that spiritual masters call non-duality, the dissolution of separation between subject and object, observer and observed. This experience is not mystical in a supernatural sense, but represents the natural functioning of the human brain when freed from perceptual filters imposed by socialization and linguistic conditioning. When you make the inside like the outside and the outside like the inside. This second instruction of Logion 22 points to the dissolution of the boundary between subjective and objective world, between mind and matter. Psychologist Carl Jung, in his concept of synchronicity, extensively documented how external events often align significantly with internal psychic states in ways that transcend conventional causality. His collaboration with physicist Wolfgang Pauli explored how the Cartesian division between mind and matter may be fundamentally illusory. Anthropologist Jeremy Narby, in his work, The Cosmic Serpent, documented how Amazonian indigenous shamans, through ritual ingestion of ayahuasca, access precise molecular biological knowledge that, according to the conventional scientific paradigm, would be impossible without academic training. How to explain this phenomenon, if not by recognizing that the division between inner knowledge and outer reality is fundamentally arbitrary? The instruction, when you make the above like the below, evokes the famous Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, and suggests the harmonization between micro and macrocosmic levels of existence. Mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot, father of fractal geometry, mathematically demonstrated how self-similar patterns repeat at multiple scales throughout nature, from tree branching to galaxy distributions. This self-similarity across scales indicates an underlying coherence that transcends the apparent divisions between microcosm and macrocosm. Physicist David Peat, collaborator of David Bohm, proposed in his book Synchronicity, The Bridge Between Matter and Mind, that these fractal patterns may be manifestations of an underlying implicate order that connects all levels of reality. Wouldn't this be precisely the realization that Jesus describes as necessary to enter the kingdom? When you make the male and the female one and the same, this part of the protocol refers to the integration of polarized principles that structure our psychic experience. Neuroscientist Andrew Newberg, using positron emission tomography, PET scans, documented how advanced states of meditation and mystical contemplation produce measurable changes in brain activity, particularly reducing activity in the parietal lobe, the region responsible for our sense of separateness and spatial orientation. In his book, Why God Won't Go Away, Newberg demonstrates how these contemplative practices dissolve the binary categories, including gender identity, that normally structure our perception, resulting in states of transcendent unity that correspond precisely to what Jesus describes in Logion 22. Could the contemporary fascination with non-binary states of consciousness and identity represent an emerging collective intuition of this fundamental esoteric truth? The most enigmatic instruction of Logion 22, when you fashion eyes in the place of an eye, and a hand in place of a hand, suggests a radical transformation in our way of perceiving and interacting with reality. Neurophysiologist Carl Pribram, in his holonomic brain theory, proposed that our perception operates as a holographic system, where each part potentially contains the whole. Studies with people who have developed synesthesia, a neurological condition where stimuli in one sense automatically evoke experiences in another, such as seeing sounds or tasting colors, demonstrate that the divisions between our sensory systems are more fluid than we conventionally assume. Neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran demonstrated that these sensory crosswirings can be experimentally induced through simple perceptual exercises. When Jesus instructs to make eyes in place of an eye, isn't he describing an integrated synesthetic perception that transcends artificial divisions between our senses? A likeness in place of a likeness. This enigmatic final instruction of Logion May 22nd refer to the transcendence of symbolic and conceptual mediation that characterizes ordinary human cognition. Transpersonal psychologist Stanislav Grof, in decades of research with non-ordinary states of consciousness, documented how people in holotropic states often report accessing information and experiences that completely transcend their biographical, cultural, and even historical limitations. In his book, The Holotropic Mind, Grof proposes that human consciousness is not confined to the brain, but can access a non-local informational field, precisely what the Gnostics called the pleroma. When Jesus speaks of replacing a likeness in place of a likeness, isn't he instructing his disciples to abandon perception mediated by culturally conditioned symbols and concepts to directly access reality without interpretive filters? The most revolutionary aspect of Logion 22 is its implication that this perceptual transformation is not merely subjective, but literally alters the nature of experienced reality. Physicist John Wheeler, with his concept of a participatory universe, proposed that conscious observers do not merely passively witness reality, but actively participate in its creation. As he famously stated, no phenomenon is a real phenomenon until it is an observed phenomenon. If we accept the implications of quantum physics and morphogenetic field theory, we must conclude that the transformation described in Logion 22 is not mere psychological change, but a genuine reprogramming of the information matrix that underlies consensual reality. When groups of people simultaneously become passers-by, transcending the fundamental dichotomies that structure ordinary perception, new existential possibilities literally materialize in the collective morphogenetic field. Psychiatrist and near-death experience, NDE, researcher Raymond Moody has documented thousands of cases where clinically dead people report surprisingly consistent experiences of transcending space-time limitations, accessing universal knowledge, and dissolving fundamental dualities. Exactly the state described in Logion 22. Most fascinatingly, many of these people demonstrate permanent transformations in their perceptual faculties after returning to physical life. Dutch neurologist Pim van Lommel, in his prospective study of NDEs published in the prestigious Lancet, documented how patients who went through these experiences often develop capabilities unexplained by conventional neuroscience, including enhanced perception, electromagnetic sensitivity, and even documented effects on electronic equipment. Are we not facing contemporary scientific evidence of what Jesus called entering the kingdom, a literal transformation in the perceptual and interactive capabilities of the human being? Professor Michael Persinger of Laurentian University developed the God Helmet, a device that applies weak magnetic fields to the temporal lobe, inducing mystical and unity experiences in experimental volunteers. Most interestingly, people who have undergone intense spiritual practices throughout their lives demonstrate these experiences even when the device is turned off, placebo effect, but their electroencephalograms record brain changes identical to cases where the device is active. Persinger concludes that the human brain has developed specific circuits to transcend ordinary dualistic perception, exactly what Logion 22 instructs to activate. This discovery suggests that the Gnostic protocol is not an abstract concept, but a precise technique for activating latent neurological capacities that allow us to literally perceive and interact with dimensions of reality normally filtered by ordinary perception. Logion 22 ends with the promise, "Then will you enter the kingdom," not as a future reward after death, but as an immediate realization available to anyone who applies the described Gnostic protocol. Neuroscientist Andrew Newberg, in partnership with meditation specialist Mark Waldman, used advanced neuroimaging to document how contemplative practices that dissolve dualities produce measurable changes in brain regions associated with self-perception, sensory processing, and temporal consciousness. In their book, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, they demonstrate that these neurological transformations are not just temporary, but can produce permanent structural alterations through neuroplasticity, literally reconfiguring the neurological hardware to sustain a non-dual perception. Isn't this the contemporary scientific evidence of what the Gnostic Jesus described 2 millennia ago as the process of becoming a passerby, transcending the perceptual limitations imposed by the consensual matrix to experience and co-create a fundamentally new reality? If morphogenetic fields truly sustain our collective perception of reality, and if Logion 22 of the Gospel of Thomas offers us a protocol to transcend the limitations of this perception, the question naturally arises: how can we apply this knowledge practically in our lives? Far from being mere philosophical speculation, there are specific techniques, many validated by contemporary scientific research, that allow us to literally reprogram our perceptual interface with the matrix of reality. Neuroanatomist and consciousness researcher Joe Dispenza has documented hundreds of cases where people using specific meditation techniques manage to alter not only their mental states but literally reorganize their biology, from cancer remissions to regeneration of degenerated tissues. His work, recorded in quantitative EEGs and functional magnetic resonance imaging, demonstrates how states of deep brain coherence can fundamentally alter our relationship with the morphogenetic field that underpins physical reality. Have you ever wondered why some people seem capable of manifesting experiences that, according to the laws of statistical probability, would be practically impossible? The first practical technique derived from the Gnostic protocol involves the conscious dissolution of basic perceptual polarities. Researcher John Grinder, co-creator of neurolinguistic programming, developed the exercise called polarity integration, where the practitioner consciously identifies apparent opposites in their experience: light/darkness, pleasure/pain, contraction/expansion, and gradually dissolves the boundary between them through sustained attention to the liminal point where they meet. EEG studies show that this exercise produces a state of hemispheric coherence rarely observed in ordinary cognition. Both brain hemispheres synchronize their waves in alpha-theta frequencies, 7 to 12 Hz, creating what neuroscientists call an interhemispheric bridge. Isn't this precisely the neurological realization of making 2-1 mentioned in Logion 22? The second technique involves the practice of stereoscopic vision of consciousness, developing the ability to simultaneously maintain divided attention between internal and external perceptions. Russian psychologist G.I. Gurdjieff called this self-remembering, a state where the person remains aware of their bodily sensations, emotional states, and mental processes while simultaneously perceiving the outer world with total clarity. Neuroscientist Stephen LaBerge, a pioneer in lucid dream research at Stanford, documented how this state of meta-awareness produces specific neurological signatures, particularly an increase in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity simultaneously with areas associated with sensory perception. This unusual neural synchronization corresponds precisely to making the inside like the outside and the outside like the inside of Logion 22, creating a state where the habitual division between subject and object begins to dissolve. The third practical technique derives from the instruction to make the male and the female one and the same, and involves the conscious integration of the sympathetic, associated with action, assertiveness, traditionally masculine qualities, and parasympathetic, associated with relaxation, receptivity, traditionally feminine qualities, neurological systems. The HeartMath Institute has scientifically developed and validated a technique called heart coherence, where the practitioner consciously generates a sustained positive emotional state while synchronizing their breathing with their heart rhythm. Monitoring with electrocardiogram and infrared spectroscopy demonstrates that this practice produces a unique state of autonomic balance, where the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems operate in harmony rather than alternation. Precisely the neurological integration of masculine and feminine principles that the Gnostic protocol prescribes. The enigmatic instruction to fashion eyes in the place of an eye can be interpreted as a technique to transcend fragmented sensory perception and develop what philosopher Henri Bergson called perceptual sympathy, a form of direct knowledge that apprehends reality from within, rather than externally through separate senses. The practical method involves what researchers in contemplative neuroscience call panoramic non-focal attention, a form of perception where, instead of focusing on specific objects in the visual field, the practitioner expands their awareness to encompass the entire perceptual field simultaneously, including peripheral senses normally filtered by ordinary consciousness. Transpersonal psychologist Charles Tart documented how this state of unified perception produces a radical reorganization of the structure of consciousness, allowing access to information that transcends normal space-time limitations. Exactly what the Gnostics called direct knowledge, gnosis. The transformation, a hand in place of a hand, suggests a technique to transcend our identification with the physical body as a separate and limited entity. Consciousness researcher Thomas Campbell, a physicist who worked with Robert Monroe in developing hemisync technology for inducing non-ordinary states of consciousness, has extensively documented how the practice of consciousness projection produces a fundamental reorganization in body self-image. Using advanced biometric sensors, Campbell demonstrated that experienced practitioners can voluntarily shift their center of identity beyond the boundaries of the physical body, experiencing what he calls non-local consciousness. Most fascinatingly, these individuals often report access to verifiable information that would be impossible to obtain through physical senses, exactly as described in Gnostic traditions about the capacity of liberated consciousness to travel through the eons and access direct knowledge. Possibly the most revolutionary aspect of the Gnostic protocol involves the collective application of these techniques to literally reprogram the shared morphogenetic field. The Global Consciousness Project, a scientific initiative led by engineers and physicists from Princeton University, maintains a network of random event generators, REGs, worldwide, continuously monitoring statistical deviations that correlate with events of significant collective consciousness. Their data, accumulated over more than 2 decades, demonstrate that events that focus global attention, such as 9/11 or major world celebrations, produce statistically impossible deviations in the output of these random generators. What would happen if groups of people intentionally trained in Gnostic techniques of perceptual transcendence collectively focused their intention on consciously reprogramming morphogenetic fields? Wouldn't we be facing the literal possibility of hacking the matrix of consensual reality? Neurotheologist Newberg and his team at the University of Pennsylvania have conducted fascinating studies using SPECT, single-photon emission computed tomography, to map brain activity of experienced meditators from various traditions during deep states of contemplation. They consistently documented a dramatic reduction in blood flow to the superior parietal lobe, the brain region responsible for creating our sense of spatial and temporal separation from the environment. Simultaneously, they observed increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, associated with focused attention and meta-reflection. This specific neurological reorganization corresponds precisely to the state described in Logion 22, a dissolution of habitual perceptual boundaries combined with elevated metacognitive lucidity. Fascinatingly, individuals demonstrating these neurological signatures often report experiences of fundamental unity with everything and access to knowledge that transcends their biographical limitations. Exactly what the Gnostics called awakening from sleep in the Demiurge's prison. The most practical and immediate application of the Gnostic protocol involves what we might call controlled disidentification, the systematic practice of recognizing the automatic perceptual filters that structure our experience of reality and deliberately suspending them. Linguist Alfred Korzybski, founder of general semantics, developed specific exercises to identify and transcend what he called elementalistic identification, our tendency to confuse conceptual maps with the territory of direct experience. His technique of abstraction awareness involves developing the ability to simultaneously perceive multiple levels of neurological processing between stimulus and conscious perception. Advanced practitioners of this technique report extraordinary perceptual flexibility, the ability to literally reorganize their experience of reality by consciously modifying their neurological processing filters. Isn't this exactly what the Gnostic Jesus describes as becoming a passerby, transcending the perceptual automatisms that keep consciousness imprisoned in the Platonic cave? Logion 22 concludes with the promise that those who implement this protocol will enter the kingdom, a radical transformation not only in subjective perception but in the very nature of experienced reality. Quantum physics, morphogenetic field theory, and contemporary research in contemplative neuroscience offer a coherent explanatory model for how this could literally occur. By transcending the perceptual filters that limit our consciousness to the consensual reality model, we literally become passers-by between existential possibilities that have always been present in the quantum field, but inaccessible through ordinary perception. The longitudinal study by researcher Bill Bankston with advanced practitioners of energy manipulation techniques documented how individuals who develop specific states of non-ordinary consciousness can produce biophysical effects that defy the laws of statistical probability, from documented cures of terminal cancer to measurable alterations in environmental electromagnetic fields. If we collectively apply the Gnostic protocol with discipline and precision, who can say what latent possibilities in the morphogenetic field we could manifest in the shared reality we call world? We are at an unprecedented moment in the history of human consciousness, an evolutionary crossroads where ancient Gnostic wisdom converges with the most advanced discoveries of contemporary science. This convergence is not mere coincidence, but an emergent pattern in the morphogenetic field of the human species, signaling a possible transformation in the very nature of collective consciousness. Physicist and philosopher Peter Russell, in his pioneering work, The Global Brain Awakens, documented how the exponential development of global interconnectivity from telecommunications to the internet mirrors the development of neural networks in complex organisms, suggesting that humanity is developing a global brain, capable of processing information and generating consciousness on a planetary scale. Simultaneously, research in contemplative neuroscience demonstrates that practices for transcending dualistic perception, precisely the techniques encoded in the Gospel of Thomas, are becoming accessible and scientifically validated on an unprecedented scale. Are we witnessing the birth of a new stage in the evolution of human consciousness, or simply rediscovering capacities that have always been our birthright? Researcher Jean Gebser, in his monumental work, The Ever-Present Origin, identified 5 structures of consciousness that emerged sequentially in human history: archaic, magical, mythical, mental, and integral. Each structure represents not only a different way of interpreting reality, but literally a distinct way of perceiving and interacting with the world. Gebser extensively documented how these structures do not completely replace previous ones, but incorporate them into more complex configurations. The integral structure, emerging in our current era, is characterized precisely by the ability to transcend fundamental dualities and perceive reality as an interconnected whole, free from the space-time limitations of ordinary perception. Isn't it surprising how this description, based on decades of anthropological and philosophical investigation, corresponds exactly to the state of consciousness that Logion 22 describes as entering the kingdom? Quantum physicist Amit Goswami proposes in his work Physics of the Soul that consciousness is not an epiphenomenon of matter, but the primordial foundation of reality, a complete inversion of the dominant materialist paradigm. His hypothesis of the unity of consciousness suggests that both matter and mind emerge from a unified field of non-local consciousness, accessible in specific states of neural coherence. Anthropologist Jeremy Narby, after decades studying shamanic traditions, documented in The Cosmic Serpent how indigenous cultures access precise biological knowledge through non-ordinary states of consciousness, knowledge that would be inexplicable without direct access to a non-local informational field. Most fascinatingly, both The contemporary quantum physicist and the Amazonian shaman describe a process fundamentally identical to what the Gnostic Jesus encodes in Logion 22, the dissolution of conventional boundaries of perception to directly access the informational substrate of reality. Is this trans-temporal and cross-cultural convergence evidence of a fundamental truth about the nature of human consciousness? Psychiatrist Stanislav Grof's research with non-ordinary states of consciousness reveals a surprising discovery. When ordinary psychological defenses are temporarily suspended, whether through deep meditative practices or psychedelic catalysts used in controlled therapeutic contexts, human beings from all cultures and backgrounds consistently report experiences that transcend biographical limitations and access what Grof calls transpersonal domains, realms of experience that correspond precisely to Gnostic descriptions of the pleroma. In his clinical work documented in the book, The Holotropic Mind, patients with no prior knowledge of esoteric traditions often describe cosmologies, entities, and spiritual processes remarkably similar to those described in Gnostic texts, including encounters with what they call false gods that attempt to keep human consciousness in limited states of perception. How to explain this remarkable cross-cultural and trans-historical consistency, if not by recognizing that these experiences represent genuine contact with dimensions of reality normally filtered by consensual perception? Evolutionary biologist Bruce Lipton, in his revolutionary work, The Biology of Belief, extensively documented how our perceptions and beliefs literally reprogram our genetic expression through epigenetic mechanisms. His research demonstrates that identical cells exposed to different perceptual environments develop radically distinct structures and functions, not by altering the genetic code, but by modifying which genes are expressed or suppressed. This revolutionary discovery in molecular biology offers a precise biological mechanism for what the Gnostic protocol describes: the capacity of consciousness to literally reprogram physical manifestation through the transcendence of conventional perceptual filters. Most fascinatingly, Lipton documented how these epigenetic changes affect not only the individual organism, but can be transmitted to subsequent generations, exactly as morphogenetic field theory predicts. Are we not facing the possibility that the collective transformation of human consciousness through the Gnostic protocol could literally reprogram the human genome on an evolutionary scale? The phenomenon of synchronicities, significantly connected events without apparent causal relationship, has been rigorously studied by physicist F. David Peat and psychologist Carl Jung. Both concluded, from different disciplinary perspectives, that synchronicities represent cracks in ordinary perceptual filters that allow glimpses of the implicit order underlying consensual reality. Parapsychologist Jessica Utz, using statistically rigorous meta-analyses of decades of experiments in precognition and remote viewing, demonstrated that humans possess perceptual capacities that transcend conventional space-time limitations with indisputable statistical significance. Project Stargate, a secret U.S. government research program in extrasensory perception, documented hundreds of cases where individuals trained in specific consciousness expansion techniques could access precise information about distant locations and events, without any possibility of using conventional physical senses. Aren't these scientifically documented phenomena precisely validating what the Gnostic Jesus teaches when he says, "Know what is in front of your face, and what is hidden from you will be revealed to you"? Logion 5. Researcher Nassim Haramein, in his unified field theory, proposes a revolutionary cosmological model where all matter and energy is fundamentally connected through singularity points in its subquantum structure. His mathematical work demonstrates how each atom in the universe potentially contains the information of the entire cosmos, a model that offers physical mathematical foundation for the Gnostic concept that each human being contains a spark of divine totality. Most fascinatingly, Haramein, working purely from physical and geometric principles, derives equations that precisely predict what esoteric traditions have described for millennia: the holographic and fractal nature of reality, where each part potentially contains the whole. When we combine this cosmological model with the Gnostic protocol of Logion 22, a revolutionary possibility emerges. By transcending the fundamental dualities that structure our perception, we can directly access the singularity point in our own consciousness, where all information and possibilities of the cosmos potentially reside. Itzhak Bentov's pioneering work on states of consciousness and bioenergy, documented in his book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, mapped how different brain frequencies correspond to different states of reality perception. Using sophisticated instrumentation, Bentov demonstrated that deep meditative states produce coherence between brain, heart, and respiratory oscillations, creating what he called a holographic mode of information processing, where consciousness transcends space-time limitations of ordinary perception and directly accesses the informational field underlying physical reality. Most notably, Bentov, before his premature death, was developing technology to facilitate the induction of these states of consciousness in people without extensive meditative training, a possibility he predicted would fundamentally revolutionize human civilization. Are we not now, for decades after his pioneering research, on the technological and cultural threshold to collectively implement this vision? The convergence between ancient Gnosticism and cutting-edge science confronts us with a profound existential question. If we really possess the latent capacity to transcend the perceptual limitations that structure our consensual experience of reality, why do so few of us manifest this capacity in our daily lives? The Gnostics offered a provocative answer. Archetypal forces they called archons actively work to keep human consciousness in limited states of perception through mechanisms of distraction, fear, and fragmentation. Transpersonal psychologist Robert Masters extensively documented how conditioned neurological patterns, what he calls crystallized ego states, actively resist dissolution, using sophisticated defensive mechanisms to maintain their perceptual structure intact. This neuropsychological phenomenon corresponds precisely to what the Gnostics described as the action of archons to keep humanity in a state of hypnotic sleep. The crucial question for each of us becomes, are we willing to face the temporary discomfort of dissolving these defensive structures to access the expanded capacities of consciousness that are our evolutionary heritage? Quantum physicist John Hagelin conducted fascinating experiments demonstrating how groups of meditators practicing specific consciousness expansion techniques can produce measurable effects on broad social indicators, such as reduction in crime and violence rates in entire metropolitan areas. His studies, published in peer-reviewed journals such as the Journal of Conflict Resolution, rigorously demonstrate what the Gnostics intuitively understood. Human consciousness is not an isolated phenomenon within individual skulls, but an interconnected field that directly affects the matrix of collective reality. Most extraordinary is that these effects follow the square root law, where the number of people needed to affect a larger population is approximately the square root of 1% of that population. This precise mathematical discovery suggests that if just a few thousand human beings consistently applied the Gnostic protocol of perceptual transcendence, they could literally reprogram the morphogenetic field of all humanity. Isn't this the deepest implication of Jesus' teaching when he says, "You are the light of the world," Matthew 5 verse 14, that each awakened consciousness becomes a reprogramming node in the matrix of collective reality? The Gospel of Thomas concludes with the enigmatic Logion 1:14, where Jesus says, "For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." This verse, often misinterpreted through modern cultural lenses, refers precisely to the protocol of perceptual transcendence described in Logion 22, the integration of fundamental polarities of consciousness to access a state that transcends all dualities. What the Gnostic Jesus is really saying is that any human being, regardless of gender, ethnicity, culture, or era, who implements this protocol of perceptual transcendence will enter the kingdom, will directly experience the unlimited nature of reality beyond consensual filters. This is not an abstract religious promise about future salvation, but a precise technical statement about the latent capacities of human consciousness. The question that the Gospel of Thomas leaves us with echoes through the millennia to our era of planetary transformation. Now that we simultaneously have ancient Gnostic knowledge and modern scientific validation about the fundamental malleability of reality, what will we choose to collectively create in the morphogenetic field we share? The journey we have taken through the mysteries of quantum Gnosticism reveals an extraordinary truth that transcends eras and paradigms. Reality as we experience it is neither fixed nor immutable, but a dynamic field of possibilities that responds to consciousness. The Gospel of Thomas, with its enigmatic Logion 22 instructing us to become passers-by, is not mere mystical poetry, but a precise technical protocol for transcending the limitations of conditioned perception and directly accessing the source code of the existential matrix. When we understand how morphogenetic fields sustain our collective experience, and how quantum physics validates the fundamental Gnostic intuition that the observer consciously participates in the manifestation of reality, we discover not only an ancient lost wisdom, but the key to our future evolution as a species. This knowledge confronts us with a deeply personal choice. Will we remain prisoners in the Platonic cave of projected shadows, accepting the limitations of consensual reality, or will we dare to implement the Gnostic protocol to awaken our latent capacities and become conscious co-creators of the reality we experience? The path to hacking the matrix does not require external technology, but the disciplined application of techniques that awaken our internal potential to transcend dualities and directly access the morphogenetic field that sustains existence. If you're interested in exploring more about spirituality, I've specially selected for you some videos full of profound knowledge and fascinating discoveries that you'll love. Just click on one of them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-discovery and spiritual learning. Your commitment to knowledge is the first step to transforming your reality.